Welcome to Revenue Rehab, your one-stop destination for collective solutions to the biggest challenges faced by marketing leaders today. Now head on over to the couch, make yourself comfortable, and get ready to change the way you approach revenue. Leading your recovery is modern marketer, author, speaker, and chief operating officer at Tegrita, Brandi Starr.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Revenue Rehab. I am your host, Brandi Starr, and we have another amazing episode for you today. I am joined by John David. John brings decades of experience representing companies, both large and small. His expertise in crisis communications encompasses a wide spectrum from managing media scrutiny, both earned and undeserved, to navigating sensitive situations like workplace violence and financial scams. John is also the author of How to Protect or Destroy Your Reputation Online. Welcome to Revenue Rehab. Your session begins now.
Thanks so much for having me, Brandi. I appreciate it.
I am excited to talk to you today. But before we jump into our topic, I like to break the ice with a little woo-saw moments that I call buzzword banishment. So tell me, what industry buzzword would you like to get rid of forever?
Well, actually, I have a lot. I had an employee a few years ago who created a file, kind of on our main server that was titled "Words John Hates." And so and there's a lot of them out there, but one that's just, I think, forever and ever, I'll never understand is facilitate. I'm not big on euphemisms, and to me, facilitate means assist, facilitate means help, facilitate means there's all these things that it means that are better than that word. So why spend 4 syllables when you can do it in 2? Why use a big word when you can use a simple word? And as a writer and a communicator, and as someone who went to journalism school, I've always just been, we're using these words that just, there's so many better options than that, and that's one of my big ones.
Yeah, I would agree. It is a word that I can't say I use a lot, but I definitely use. And I do think a lot of these overused words, it's like someone starts using it and then everybody starts using it. And I don't know that anybody ever really knows why. Like, why did that become a popular word? Because you're right, it is a longer word and there are so many more better ways to say it. So I can promise that I won't try to facilitate anything today.
Please don't facilitate me today. I can just not, can't handle it today.
I was gonna say, I am curious how many of the ones on your list I probably overuse, because I do recognize that I tend to be a violator of the buzzwords.
There's a few, that I just like, I've never really liked. I just like empower is another one. I think of gets overused a lot. There's a lot of systems get deployed. Everything's getting deployed, like we're all going off to war. There's just a lot of them. There's a lot of them like that, which that when you sort of run your own consulting business and you're the head of the you're the leader of the style police, you get to pick a few ones that I just don't like that word. I don't want to use that word. So I just have a few, and it's my own quirk as much as anything else.
Well, awesome. Now that we have gotten that off our chest, tell me, what brings you to Revenue Rehab?
Well, we're in an interesting time, where we've seen a lot in the recent days and weeks and months and years of communications crisis, where companies get into have issues that can really, do incredible damage to their business. And I specialize in crisis communications, and I've worked with companies, both large and small, in handling communications issues that could severely impact, in a negative way, their business. And so I work with companies of all different shapes and sizes to prepare for, as best we can, and then manage communications crises. And so, and it can be anything from, I like to say, you kind of go from from the sort of simple and seemingly benign to existential, and so a communications crisis can cause your business. It can slowly erode your bottom line. It can destroy your reputation. It's something that most managers will deal with something like this. Most communications professionals will deal with something like this. Marketing managers, CMOs, they're going to have something's going to happen where that they have to know how to communicate during a crisis situation, and that's the type of work that we like to do.
Okay, yeah, it is one of those things that you hope to never have to encounter, but it is better to, be prepared and know how best to handle it. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion because it's definitely something that I know I don't personally feel prepared for. And I thankfully have not, had to handle it this far in my career. But before we dive in, I believe in setting intentions. It gives us focus, it gives us purpose, and most important, it gives our audience an understanding of what they should expect from our conversation today. And so I'd love to hear, what's your intention? What would you like people to take away?
I think that my main intention is that you can prepare for a communications crisis, that you should prepare for a communications crisis. You don't necessarily have to figure out every last detail, but there's a lot of like fundamental things you can do in advance to prepare yourself, your company, and your team, so that you're better aware, better prepared to manage a situation when it hits. Be able to identify it, be able to triage it, and craft a response. And that's my main mantra.
Okay. And before I know those fundamentals is the key place that I want to dive in with you. But before we get to that, I do want to just talk about, we see, I mean, we're coming on the heels, like the CrowdStrike situation wasn't, too far distant past. And that was a big one because, you had issues with the company itself and their
Right.
crisis communications. But then even I look at companies like Delta Airlines, like I am loyal to Delta. They were impacted far beyond other people, when other airlines and banks and everything had recovered because of the system that went down with the pilots and flight attendants. It was a good bit of time after everyone else had recovered that they're still, in crisis mode. And so I know that there's, a lot of ways where some companies handle it right or well. And, from listening to other people, many feel like CrowdStrike handled it well. And then there's other companies that don't. They totally #fail. And so I'd love to start with some of your thoughts around, what do you think makes the difference between an organization that is able to, lean in, handle these things, and come out all right on the other end versus those companies that just kind of fall apart?
Right. Well, I think in the CrowdStrike story is interesting because I think what CrowdStrike did right. They obviously they had the problem. It was their problem. It was a software update. There was some issue with it, whatever it was, but they took ownership of it immediately. It happened, for those of us in the U.S., it happened kind of overnight initially, and so they were, their response, that we sort of, in the U.S., we got the response first thing in the morning. So they looked as though they were responding quickly when they basically probably had a little bit of an advantage, and that most of us were asleep when it first hit. But they took ownership of the issue, and I think that was why they came out a little bit better. I mean, they've got big problems. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, they've got big problems at all. They've crashed all their customers, causing, probably, billions of dollars in losses and issues and everything. So they have bigger problems, but from a communication standpoint, they did a good job in that they took ownership of it. And they said, this is us. This is not a terrorist act. This is not a cyber attack. This is us. We did this. And then it filters down from there, and then you have you have the other companies that were impacted by it, and the airlines are a really good example. The airlines are pretty well schooled in what to do with when a crisis hits. I mean, they probably had the best crisis plans going, because planes unfortunately crash sometimes, and there's weather delays and things like that, and I think that I think it's very difficult for those organizations that are so big, that have so many customers, for them to properly communicate. And they do the best they can, but it's almost like an overwhelming crisis. There's nothing they can do. I mean, I was stuck in a few years back. There was a storm, and I ended up getting stuck in New York City for a couple of days. And I was on Delta, and I had to call. I was trying to get a new flight, and you'd call, and it would say your approximate wait time is 6 hours and 37 minutes. And it's like, wait, what? I mean, it's like, I thought, do you mean 6 minutes and 37 seconds, or you mean 6 hours and 30? So there's certain things when these crises are just overwhelming, and they kind of have to do the best that they can. And while I was really upset with Delta over that, I realized that a lot of this wasn't in their control, but they could always do better at communicating it. And that's what I think that's where I think there's opportunity for every company to put things in place to better communicate when something goes wrong, whether it's a text messaging system, or it's through their app, or something that where you can actually communicate what's going on, so that you don't have everyone completely livid with you.
Okay. And yeah, I do think that that's sort of that what you were talking about in preparation of like having an actual plan, because it's also like, what if texting goes down? What's your avenue if email goes down? It's like having that multifaceted plan. And so let's jump in. You hinted about the fundamentals. You talked about being able to identify, triage, and craft a response. So let us in on what we should be preparing for. What are some of those fundamentals?
Well, so the first thing, the most important thing when you're dealing with a crisis, is to get the facts as best you can. Oftentimes, misinformation kind of rules the day. That you get whatever comes out first, and so it's getting all your facts aligned, and then determining your kind of your messaging strategy. And the first thing, I always believe, is that you should have simple things for a company. They should be able to reach out to, have a means to reach out to all their employees, or a means to reach out to their customers and stakeholders, and then and that's something as simple as just making sure you have everybody's phone number. You have the top people in the company have all their phone numbers. You know where they are. And then having the being able to come up with some basic messaging when dealing with, if there's a media call, that you always want to, you don't want to no comment the media, but you can always tell the media, listen, I don't have a comment right this second, but can I get back to you in half an hour? Can I get back to you in 45 minutes? We want to talk to you. We want to tell you what's going on, but we want to make sure we have an answer that makes sense for you. So having that basic plan in place. Who's our spokesperson going to be if there's a crisis? Who's our team that's going to help with the messaging? Who do we call? How do we respond if there's a media inquiry? And do you have a media policy in place? A lot of companies do, and some of them don't. Media policy is simply a document. You can tuck it into your employee manual that says, here's what happens if the media calls you. You're not you're an employee. You're not a spokesperson for the company. If someone reaches out to you, forward them to this person in communications, or this external consultant, or both, or your boss, or your supervisor, whatever it is, and having this just sort of plan in place, so that if something happens, at least you're not like 100% flat-footed. And that's like step number one. And then the next step is to triage the situation, and kind of get a lay of, okay, here, what happened, how many people are impacted, and how do we best communicate our position of what happened to this group. And that's, and maybe that's through, a direct communication to clients, which we shared with the media, maybe it's through a social media post. You have to come up with your message and then how you distribute it, and then you have to manage, the questions and the follow up and the inevitable things that are going to happen, like social media coverage and whatever crazy memes and everything that comes after that. And there's some of it is you have to sort of just take your medicine, and other things you have to you have to respond to. So it's all about triaging the situation, understanding what's going on, so you get all your facts straight, and then communicating it out in a clear way.
Okay. And this, like, I think a lot of times we think about the big companies, like when something happens with a large company, CrowdStrike, Delta, like all these big companies, there is a lot more attention on it. There's a lot more media, all these sorts of things. And I feel like smaller organizations can almost get a little too comfortable, because, it's one of those things, like if something happens with our 25-person consultancy, I don't know that CNN or Fox News is, going to be banging down our doors. And so how do we think about this, or, differently, or do we think about this differently if we are at a smaller organization versus a larger one?
Well, I think that I think your premise is a really good talking point. But the reality is that I think smaller businesses could be even at more risk. And it's because you don't need a newspaper or media outlet, you just need one of these, right? So
Right.
if something happens at your small business and a customer can take a video of what happens at your business, and it can be on the internet in seconds, right? Through via Twitter/X, or Facebook, or whatever, and any social media platforms. So everybody has a camera in their hand, everybody has a way of communicating with the whole planet in their hand. So there's a lot of risk associated with that. And I think that we I like to give the example of, imagine that, in your local fast food restaurant, whatever, it's McDonald's, it's Burger King, whatever it is, and somebody sees, a mouse run across the dining room floor, right? Well, for McDonald's, or, Burger King, or whatever, one of these big companies, that's embarrassing, right? It's a problem. It's you may lose a little bit of market share in that area, because people are going to go, oh my God, there was a mouse at the McDonald's on Main Street, right? But that's not going to impact that company's brand, right? It's going to be one instance in one place. But if you have a local restaurant that's, mom and pop, and that happens, that's existential. That could
Yeah.
mean that could shut them down. Most businesses are not, are run, week to week, month to month kind of thing. And if all of a sudden you lose all your regulars at a restaurant because there's a perceived issue with, cleanliness or whatever, the type of thing happens that, listen, my wife's never going there, right? So like when those things happen, you could have an existential crisis that is with a small business that would just be kind of another day at the office for a big business. So I think you always have to be prepared for any of those things. And because it's so easy to put a review on Yelp, it's so easy to write a post on Facebook. And so it's almost as more important to be vigilant and be prepared, as a small business.
Yeah. And, I think what I take away from that is being small doesn't mean that you don't have to prepare for big impacts. Like it scales essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in South Florida, and we're in the hurricane zone, right? So we have these disruptions that happen, and there's sort of like, there's a rhythm to them. It's like all of a sudden you get a hurricane warning, and that means okay, and you might have a hurricane force winds in 48 hours, and like the marketplace sort of knows how to respond to that. And so you can look at things like that and say, okay, yeah, here's what we do when there's hurricane. Here's what we do when there's a snowstorm. Here's what we do if there's, some weather thing that impacts our business. And just think in terms of, what else could happen? What could, game it out a little bit? Like what's my worst case scenario? and for my business that could really cause me a lot of pain, and prepare for it as much as you can. I'm not, you don't have to spend 1,000 hours preparing for it, but to be prepared to. So here's what I'm going to do if something happens that has the potential to bring down my business. And it's not just like natural disasters or cyber outages. I mean, every business is vulnerable to things like embezzlement issues. There's it happens all the time. There's issues of workplace violence. There's issues of other types of kind of criminal things that happen at companies. There's sexual harassment claims. I mean, those are, there's succession issues. If you lose a top executive, what's going to happen? There's issues of when you lose an employee to a competitor. To me, those are all crisis situations. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be that there's something that makes the national news. There's all these situations where you have to be prepared and you have to know how to communicate with your audience. Otherwise, you could be in, your business could be in big trouble.
Yeah. And I think that's a really, really good point. It sort of broadens my perspective in what I think about as crisis, because there's things that you listed that initially I would not have just thought of as a crisis, but even like with someone leaving or succession planning, or, I remember talking to a friend, she was at a B2B company, but they were fairly small, 100 and 150 people. And their CEO passed away suddenly. And it's like, now I'm thinking about that, like that is crisis communicate, so many things like that
Yeah.
that I don't necessarily think of as crisis, because I'm used to thinking of like these big, national things that happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of businesses that the founder is the company, or he's perceived to be the company. And then if that founder, something happens to that person, if that person passes away, that person becomes incapacitated, that person, whatever, gets, something happens to them. And then listen, it's dog eat dog world out there, man. There's folks who'll say, why would you want to be with this company when you should be with us? Because we're stable. They're not. There's all those things where those communications are absolutely critical. It doesn't just have to be I mean, listen, when something happens and it has the potential for to be like a national news story, that's the type of situation that that I work on frequently, and it's fast paced and it's exciting and it's high stakes and all that. But it's like I said, it's all relative. One company's one business's simple thing can be another's existential crisis, and so you have to be prepared for everything if you can be.
Okay. And I want to shift topics just a little bit, because one of the things, one of the questions that uh, always comes up for me. So, back when Scandal was on TV, I used to love that show, loved Olivia Pope. And, that was like my example of, crisis management, which, I know is overblown. But one of the things that I think about that was always a big thing on that show that I know that, companies struggle with is that balance of controlling the narrative to protect the company's reputation, balanced with like being honest with what actually happened. Because, the whole premise of that show was they were never honest. It was all about the spin. And I know, or I assume that, in real life, that's not what's happening. But I can see where an organization can struggle with trying to balance, just being transparent, being honest about what's happening, taking accountability, but also trying to, control the narrative and protect the company's reputation. So how do you strike that balance, or how do you advise people to strike that balance?
Yeah, believe me, it actually comes up. I mean, probably not in as dramatically as on Scandal, but when there's certain things that and this oftentimes when there's a controversy of some kind, and maybe there's a legal argument happening or something like that, and then there's the legal side, then there's the PR side. There's, how much, a lot of times the general public wants information from a privately held entity, right? So for example, there's if it's a company that's doing a government related project, or they're doing something and there's some type of tie-in to local government, and the public, maybe they don't like it. I deal with a lot of like real estate projects where there's, neighbors don't want a building going up next door to them, and they start to, how much are you investing in this, and what did you pay this, and who did you do this for? And a lot of it's kind of none of your business, right? I mean, like in other words, what a private company does is their business. It's not the public's business. So sometimes you get into a situation where it is kind of like that, where you're saying, okay, here's really what's going on, and here's what we're going to say. We're not going to tell the whole world everything that's going on inside our company. We're not going to show them our dirty laundry or our clean laundry. We're just going to tell them what's going on. And sometimes the answer is we're not going to say anything. I mean, sometimes there's no, you can, I'm not a believer in like no commenting things, but I'm also a believer in sort of the statement that acknowledges something's going on, but we're not going to tell you everything. Because a lot of times when you're dealing with business, it's, listen, this is commerce. There's, somebody may have, invested millions of dollars to purchase a piece of land, and they want to develop it. They own it. They have the deed. They're paying for it. They've got financing for it. Now, just because the neighbors don't like it doesn't mean that, we have to open up and acknowledge every little thing that they say, or get into a deep argument with them. It's like, we have kind of our rights too. And so I think that sometimes you have to push back against media attention and not be afraid to say to them, listen, we're going to help you and help you. You want to write a story about this. We want to participate, but listen, we're not showing you all our cards. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that is a hard thing, especially when it's another organization that sort of puts you in the bind, kind of like
Sure.
the CrowdStrike Delta situation, where it's like, we didn't do anything.
Right.
But
Yeah. I mean, ultimately you have there's that's, the best you can do. You can only blame the other guy so long, right? Eventually they say, well, you don't have redundancy at Delta. I mean, there's a million things you could go after them, but yeah, it's important that you have, it's okay to push back sometimes. I think a lot of people think they have to like roll over for a media outlet. You don't have to. I mean, it's better to have a cordial relationship, but you don't have to do everything they tell you.
yeah, and that's a really good point. And I think where I've seen a lot of companies struggle is when whatever the crisis is something that did actually happen. Like, I know of an organization where they did have a situation with sexual harassment, and it was, a particular executive, and there were multiple people, and it was like, this is a thing that did happen. So, and it was a crime. But at the same time, it was not a like widespread, company-wide sort of challenge. Like, it wasn't like the company was just accepting that this was happening.
Right.
It was a very, this person,
yeah,
was doing this. And so I know, and I was having this conversation with someone like after this whole thing had happened and settled down, and it was a real struggle for them to strike that balance of, we got to protect the company's reputation. We got to be able to hire, we don't want people leaving or overreacting or whatever. But at the same time, like, this is a thing that did happen here. And so you can't, it's like, to a certain degree, you can't no comment it, or, and I don't know if they got media attention, but it's like, it has to be addressed, but you really have to strike that balance.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the big thing, and I've been in situations like that in the past where, it's something happens and you essentially what you're trying to say is this was a one-time thing. This was not systemic. And the most important thing is that be true, right? So what the worst thing that can happen is that you say that you're essentially communicating that this is not a systemic thing, and then somebody else comes out, 2 hours later and says, well, that happened to me too. When I worked there 2 years ago and it's the same thing. And I filed a lawsuit against them too. And so then your credibility's shot, and then you're in then you have an existential problem. So you could go from something that is just kind of embarrassing or difficult or exasperating or whatever to existential. You could find your way going down, going the wrong way on the curve. So it's critical for that the person who is communicating for you knows everything that's going on, so that they can answer things, that they can answer properly, that they won't, stand up there essentially if, your spokesperson inadvertently lies, they say what they think is true and it's not true, then, again, then your credibility shot, and you're going to start taking fire from all different directions after that.
Yeah, and that I think that is also the hard part as well, because it almost feels like sometimes the person called to be the face in those media situations almost seems like they're always the ones that never have the full story. But I won't go down a rabbit hole of what I see on TV or what I see on the news.
Sure.
One question that I always like to ask, especially when it's a topic that is not my strength, is there's always a little bit of, I don't know what I don't know. And so is there anything that I haven't thought to ask you about that you feel important for CMOs and heads of marketing to know to better prepare them for how they can manage communication crisis effectively?
I think we covered a lot, but I think the biggest overarching message is to try to plan as much as you can, to try to look at what your vulnerabilities are, and to have at least the basics of a plan in place so that who to communicate with, that you have a way of a means of reaching all of your key people, of designating a spokesperson, of communicating to your employees, and then again sort of game out, okay, here's what we would do if this type of situation happened, here's what we would do if this type of situation happened, here are the people that need to know, that kind of scenario. I think that's the most that to me, that's the biggest single thing. And then know when to get help, and when to bring in somebody who has some experience, or who can help as a third party. I think that's another key aspect of this, because there's some advantages to having a third party person help you with because they have experience doing it. They also have a little bit different positioning with the media. So
that's a great point. Well, John, talking about our challenges is just the first step, and nothing changes if nothing changes. And so in traditional therapy, the therapist gives the client some homework. But here at Revenue Rehab, we like to flip that on its head and ask you to give us some homework. And so for those listening who, are feeling like they are unprepared, should a crisis hit, what's the first step? What's their one thing that they should take away and do?
I think going through the process of creating a media policy for their company, if they don't already have one, and developing the main kind of means of communication to communicate with your entire organization, so it's easy to do, and also just make sure that you have a way to reach all your key people, right, in a centralized way, and not have that rest on one person's head. In other words, if so-and-so in human resources, accidentally drops her phone in the ocean, does that mean we can't contact anybody? So we have to make sure that we have the ability to reach out to our group. And it's the old, my last thing is that it's, again, maybe it's not really buzzword, but maybe it's euphemism or whatever. But, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, like you can't, you have to prepare, do some fundamental things, and then that'll make it'll make these situations a lot easier in the future.
Awesome. Well, John, I have enjoyed our discussion, but that's our time for today. But before we go, tell us how our audience can connect with you. And also, if they find themselves in crisis and need to reach out, like, what is it that you offer? Like, give us the shameless plug.
Sure. My website is the best way to reach me, davidpr.com. So www.davidpr.com. My phone number's on my website. There's also, forums and calendar forums and all that stuff. I mean, pretty easy to get in touch with, and I answer my phone all the time because I deal with crises all the time. And if you're in a situation where you're just not sure what to do, or if you're doing the right thing, give me a call. I mean, this is my business. This is something I've been doing for decades. I love doing it. I find it fascinating and interesting, and every situation is different. And I also, I'll talk to anybody. So if you want to, you can call me, and when you're in, and I'll give you the best advice I can give you. On what your next step ought to be, and so I'm always happy to sort of help out in any way I can. If you find yourself in a tricky situation.
Well, awesome. We will make sure to link to David PR in the show notes. So wherever you are listening or watching this podcast, check the show notes so that you can connect with John. John, I've definitely taken away some action items that I will be sending to my team right after this conversation.
That's great.
Because I know there are a number of places where I don't feel prepared. So I definitely appreciate that. I think my favorite part of hosting this podcast is what I learn from all of my guests. So thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you have enjoyed my discussion with John. I can't believe we're at the end. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revenue Rehab with your host, Brandi Starr. Your session is now over, but the learning has just begun. Join our mailing list and catch up on all our shows at revenuerehab.live. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at Revenue Rehab. This concludes this week's session. We'll see you next week.